Wow, fantastic. Kibingi got this fantastic award from Dan Nolter today. I was going to say some nice things about Kibingi, but there was a lot said about him. But I just want to tell you a personal thing that happened yesterday. Kibingi has been the power behind this conference. He hasn't had much sleep for the last couple of months. And yesterday, you can imagine, he was running around. His phone was ringing every 3.5 minutes. And everybody who rang him, even though he was frantic, he'd say, I'm fine, I'm fine. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he's just got to bed. And he thinks, well, I'll put my head down for an hour. And the phone rings. It's a lady coming by bus to this conference. And she arrives at the bus station at 3 o'clock in the morning. He's just got into bed. So what's he do? Gets dressed, gets in his car, goes to the bus station, picks the lady up, and brings her here. That's the sort of commitment and responsibility. And Kibingi doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. And we thank God for him. In 1995, I had the privilege with my wife Pauline, who was able to join us this morning with our 2 daughters, to go to the very first conference of the Federation of Christian Police Fellowships, which was the forerunner of the group that Simon is now chairman of. And I was privileged to go with Commissioner of Police Shedrack Kiruki. And I think there were 18 countries represented, about 80 of us, I think, but 16, 18 countries represented. And we met in London. And there were 2 speakers. And one of the speakers was a guy that I'd never heard of because he came from a place called America. And he came to talk to us. And we found his message incredibly inspiring. And after the conference was over, he said, those of you that are interested, come with me to Scotland Yard, to the conference room in Scotland Yard, headquarters of Metropolitan Police. And I want to tell you about a vision that I've got. And so about 20, 30 of us turned up and we sat there. And Bob told us of the vision he had to start Point Man Leadership Institute, which Kibingi and I are privileged to be team directors of. And so it's a great privilege, 15 years later, to welcome Bob Vernon for the 3rd time now to Kenya. And we know that we're going to be inspired, challenged, and blessed by his 38 years of police experience with the Los Angeles Police Department. Bob, my brother, God bless you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Is this microphone working? Good. I've been asked to talk about moral and ethical dilemmas facing police officers. This is going to be very practical. I'm going to tell a lot of stories because that's what Jesus did, you know. We call them parables, right? And so that's the way I'm going to speak. I'm going to speak by telling police stories, actual situations, and try to give you some guidance as far as the type of moral dilemmas and ethical trouble spots that you may reach as a police officer. I always like to pray before I speak, and so would you please join me in a brief prayer? Father, I admit before my friends that I am incompetent of really communicating your truth, and we want it to be that. We want to learn from our experiences through your word. And so we ask that you would be the teacher here today, and I admit before my friends that I depend wholly on you and ask that you'd please help me and please help all of us to understand what you're saying to us. In Jesus' name, amen. I was a young man going through high school, and I just finished up. I think I was a senior, and a missionary came through church. And he gave a message, and I'll be honest with you, I can't remember everything he said, but one thing I do remember was his text. It was Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I'm not going to preach a sermon on that today, but I want to refer to it for a very important reason. As I approached my senior year, I wondered, what does God want me to do? And I frankly had put aside the concept of being a police officer, even though that's what I desired, because my father had been a Los Angeles police officer. And I loved my dad, and I loved his example. He was a good man. Even before he became a Christian, he was a good man. He was good and better than most Christians. And then when he became a Christian, when I was about 12 years old, man, he really took off. He was just really super then. Well, at any rate, I really respected my father, and I wanted to follow. And yet I thought, policeman, can that be Christian? You notice the question I have up here? Can law enforcement be Christian? I mean, after all, we have to get involved in fights. We use clubs, we use gas, we occasionally have to use our guns. And it just seemed to me, that's not very Christian. But, I found out something as I was studying and learning from this missionary. This missionary spoke on Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. How many of you know Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? Yeah, there's a few of you. It goes like this. There's 3 conditions, and then there's a promise. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. And then there's a promise. He will direct you. He will make your path straight in front of you. Actually, the Hebrew actually says, I know it's translated in English, he'll direct your paths, but the Hebrew word is, your path will be straight in front of you. You won't be able to miss it. It'll be so obvious you won't need a road map. But I had some questions, and so I started applying those principles as best I could. I put my faith in Christ. I invited him to become my Savior. I really trusted in him. I did more than just believe in him. I trusted him. It's kind of like the bulletproof vests that we issue our officers in America. I assume you have some over here too. They're a ballistic vest made out of Kevlar. And, unfortunately, I have a sad story to tell you. In 1 week, we had 2 of my officers shot. I was over about 10,000, so I didn't get to know all of them personally, but I knew one of these guys, and I knew the other guy a little bit. Both of them were shot in 1 week period of time, actually a week apart, and they were shot in the same place, right here in the center of the chest. One was dead within seconds, and the other survived and went back to work about a month later. The difference was they both had ballistic vests, but one was wearing it. You get the difference? Both of them believed in the vest. But belief is not enough. You have to take your belief to a point of commitment. And I think it's very significant, the word that is used in that verse, trust in the Lord. I trusted in the Lord, and I was trying not to lean on my own understanding, but to be honest with you, sometime I did. I was that typical teenager. But I was trying to lean on God's understanding, which of course is here. And then I was not ignoring him. I was trying to acknowledge him in every way. And I was depending on him to lead me. Well, now comes the test. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be, and I had kind of dismissed law enforcement, and for a reason. Let me just show you some of the things that were going through my mind. See if we can get this to work. How do we get this to work? Here we go. I think. I want that on here. Let's see. Go like this. That's interesting. Yeah, we went down. Yeah, there. There we go. Thank you, sir. It's always good to have someone who knows what he's doing around these computers, The police job does present conflicts, but you know what? So do most other jobs. If you're a salesman, quite often you're confronted with the dilemma of, do you tell the person everything about the product? Do you tell them the bad as far as the good? I mean, there's conflicts in every job, but admittedly, there's some distinctive pressures that we have as police officers. Can the job pull one away from their walk with Jesus? The answer is, of course, yes. But once again, so can other jobs. What about the use of force? A lot of people say, how can you be a police officer and use force, especially deadly force? Well, I want to point you to a verse that isn't well known. It's Exodus 22:2. Now, you'll know, most of you, Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments, and in there it says, you shall not kill. Actually, the more modern translations have given a better translation to the word kill, and they substitute the word murder. Because there are two words in the Hebrew language for taking a death. One is just you slay someone, you may intend it may be an accident, but when you murder someone, you do it with malice. You want to take their life. That's the word that's used in Exodus 20. Now, if you just go across the page to Exodus 22, verse 2, you'll find a very interesting verse. Because there are many people that say, you as police officers are violating God's laws. You carry a gun. You take a life. The Bible says you shall not kill. I always correct them and say, no, it actually says you shall not murder. But let me point you to another verse, and I always point them to Exodus 22:2. And you know what it says there? It says, if a thief be caught while breaking in at night and be smitten so that he dies, there shall no blood guiltiness be on his head. Did you hear that? It approves the use of deadly force to defend your home. And then, of course, you look at Genesis 9:6, capital punishment was ordained by God, and it was never rescinded. A lot of people say, well, you know, we really shouldn't take life because capital punishment is wrong. That's murder too. No, God established that. He said if someone takes a man's life, by man shall his life be taken. That's never been rescinded. And then, of course, in the New Testament, most of you know this one, Romans 13, it says that the ruler, in the more modern translations, because of the context, have translated that police officer. The police officer is a minister of God to execute judgment, and he does not bear the sword in vain. Now, what is a sword? It's a deadly weapon. What it's approving of is the police officer using deadly force when necessary, when legal, and when appropriate. And so that doesn't really cause any issue. I had some problems with that, and I had to have my pastor lead me through these verses so I understood. So remember, the use of force, as much as we don't like to do that, is endorsed by God, and it's actually approved by God, and it's in God's economy of how he makes things work on earth. So that in and of itself should not cause any problems as far as conflicts with being a police officer. So after I had that resolved, I thought, well, maybe I am to be a police officer, but I still felt a little hesitant about it. And so I began exploring some other interests I had, and one was to be a missionary pilot. And there was an organization in the United States called MAF, Missionary Aviation Fellowship. And so I went to college. I went to Biola, which is a Christian university. I studied under a man called J. Vernon McGee. He still is preaching in America, even though he's been in heaven for over 22 years because he's on the radio. They have him recorded. He's a great Bible teacher. I studied under him, and I applied for the Air Force, and I thought, I might as well let the United States Air Force train me how to fly, and then I'll become a missionary pilot. So I went down to take the test, and I passed the test for cadet screening. I was sent up to an air base just out of San Francisco, and I went through a series of tests. It took all week, and there were 33 of us that started, and there were only 3 of us left at the end of the week. Everybody else had been washed out for various reasons. And they said, there's only one test left. It's a psychiatric exam. Well, you know what? That's the only one I wasn't worried about. Because I thought, I'm sane. I'm not crazy or anything, so I'm not worried about this one. Well, I went in and sat down, and on the base there were 3 psychologists, and so being 3 of us, we each had different ones we went to. The one I went to sat down and looked at my folder, and he said, I see you went to Biola College. Isn't that a Christian university? I said, yes. He said, do you believe in a God? I said, yes. He said, a personal God? I said, yes, I do. He said, who do you think Jesus Christ was? I said, well, I think he was the Son of God. He said, oh, no. Let me see your fingernails. And so I showed him my fingernails. I wondered why, and he said, you don't bite them. I said, no. He said, well, there must be an emotional instability of the family because you're hyper-religious. You need religion as a crutch. I'm going to have to fail you out of the Air Force because you're too religious. And I thought, something's wrong here. And I went and I talked to the colonel who was the head of the selection team there, and he said, no, he's wrong. That's not the position of the Air Force. But since he's a psychologist and I'm not, I can't overrule him, but I can tell you what to do. You can appeal this, write a letter, and he gave me the address, and you can be re-examined by a bank of 3 psychologists, and I'm sure everything will be okay. This guy has a problem. He's an atheist, and he just despises anybody who believes in God. So I thought, well, and as I flew back, I began wondering, because I had prayed that if God didn't want me as an aviator, that he would somehow stop me. Well, God used a psychologist to stop me. I got back to Los Angeles, and my father said, what happened? I told him. He said, well, that's interesting. The L.A.P.D. has just announced their testing. They haven't tested for 5 years, and they need about 500 officers. You have a good chance you might try it out. So I, along with several other 1,000 officers, went to Hollywood High School. They had the whole high school filled with thousands of us, and we all took the exam, and they said about half of you are going to pass. Well, I passed the written exam, and then I went through a series of other exams. I'm not going to go through all those, but guess what? At the end, I passed all the exams, and there were just a few of us left. They have the statistic at that time, they only took 4 out of every 100 people that applied. And so we had one exam to go, and guess what it was? A psychological exam. And I thought, oh no. And I went in and I faced my first moral dilemma as a police officer, as a pre-police officer, really I was being examined. What do you think that dilemma was? To tell a truth about my faith in Christ, because I was afraid he's going to flunk me out again. Here's another guy, And so he looked at me and he said, for some reason, you didn't want to take this part of the examination. Now, the LAPD does a very thorough examination. They not only do a brief interview like the one in the Air Force, but they actually give you several written scales, and they give you the Rorschach test where you look at ink blots and all kinds of things. And somehow he figured out, he's a psychologist, he should be able to, he said, there was some reason that you were fearful of this exam. I said, that's correct. He said, would you tell me why? And I said, I'd rather not. He said, well, then we're going to have to flunk you on this part of the exam. And I said, well, on the other hand, I really would rather talk about it. And so I went back and I explained to him what happened at the Air Force. He said, do you mean you believe in God? And what do you think I was tempted to do? Not tell the truth. I was tempted to play it down. Well, there's probably an intelligence in the universe, but I don't know. And especially when he said, now, would you go over that again, who you told that psychiatrist you thought Jesus Christ was? And I was tempted to say, I really was. I was tempted to say, well, he was a good man, had some good thoughts. He was a good teacher, good example to us all. And it was my first moral dilemma. Should I tell the absolute truth? Well, remember that verse that I told you, those verses, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. You trust in the Lord with all your heart. You lean not into your own understanding. All your ways acknowledge him. He'll direct you. And you know what? If he doesn't want me in the police department, I don't want to be there. But if he wants me there, no psychiatrist is going to stop me. I really believe that. So I was tempted, I must admit. But I told the truth. In fact, I thought, as long as I'm going to get flunked out, I'd just soon go out in a blaze of glory. And you know what I did? I even said it stronger. I said, I believe that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, didn't have a human father, was crucified, buried, got out of the grave on the 3rd day. He's alive today, and I know him. And I thought, man, I'm out of here, And guess what? He said, well, it's great to see a young man who knows what he believes in. He said, what we found out from the Korean War just passed. He said, what we found out from the Korean War is people who are religious, who have a faith in God, who pray, are the first one the communists separate away from those that they want to brainwash, because they're too hard to brainwash, the Christians. They have a strong faith. So he said, I have the opposite opinion. He said, I know there are some psychologists who believe that religion is a crutch, but I happen to think it's a crutch we all need. It makes us stronger. And so I'm going to put you ahead and put you in the very next academy class. So I found myself working on the street, and after doing 7 months in the academy, and once again, I came upon my second moral dilemma. When you're in an academy with over 85 other, at that time it was just men, what do you think the language is like? What do you think the jokes are about? It's like the Army, you know? And right away I ran into the moral dilemma of wanting to fit in, not wanting to be different, not wanting people to say, why don't you curse? And why don't you do these things? And why don't you go out with us Friday when we're through with our studies for a week and the weekend and drink a few drinks with us? And I was tempted. But I decided once again, you know, if I'm going to depend on God to lead me, I'm going to take a stand. And I did. And I got through the academy and I graduated number 2 in my class. And I got through. And the Lord was good. I found myself working on the street. Now, as you work on the street as a police officer, are there any moral absolutes out there? Well, the Bible says there is. God labels certain conduct wrong. He actually used that word. I've given you the verse, Colossians 3:25. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. And I found a lot of things were happening out there that I didn't like. Guess what I found out about the second month I was working? I was transferred from one division to another, and I was transferred to what we call the morning watch. That starts at 11 o'clock at night and goes through till 7 in the morning. And about 3 o'clock, after the bars had emptied and we had made a few arrests and put a few people in jail, my partner said, okay, it's time to go to the hole. I said, the hole? He said, yeah, that's where we sleep. And he drove the police car up into a kind of a hilly area and down in kind of a wash. And I looked, and there were 5 other police cars there. And one of them was a sergeant. And now this was right after the L.A.P.D. had come out of a lot of corruption, and they still had some existing. And part of the corruption was that on the morning watch, when it was kind of quiet, officers would drive somewhere and go to sleep instead of looking for burglars and protecting people. And you know, that really bothered me. I thought, I'm being paid to work, not to sleep. And that was a dilemma I faced. Question, what should I do? Should I go snitch on them? Should I go tell somebody? You know what I did? I don't know if it was the right thing, but it worked for me at the time. I said, gentlemen, I talked to him. I said, I don't feel right about this. I said, I'm going to stay awake, and I'm going to read from the law books. I'm supposed to get to know this anyhow. I've got my law book with me. I'm going to read from the penal code while you guys sleep, and if any of you get a call, I'll come wake you up. But I think it's wrong to sleep while we're getting paid to work. And I had a partner, and he was a senior officer, and he drove the car, so I had to stay there with him. And I didn't like it. You know what? That only lasted 6 weeks. Because I think what happened, I think they got a little worried about me. I think they got thinking, he's going to tell on us. And so suddenly I was transferred to a day watch and a different partner and a wonderful partner. But in between, before I got the wonderful partner, I had another partner. We got a call. It was a warehouse that the burglar alarm had gone off. We went through and we searched the warehouse, and it was a false alarm. And we'd been in there better part of 45 minutes, and our flashlights were getting dim. And when we stepped outside, the man from the alarm company locked the place up and secured the place. We started to go get in the police car, and my partner handed me 3 flashlight batteries. He said, here, yours are getting dim, replace it with it. I said, where'd you get those, Bill? He said, in the warehouse. I said, you got these out of the warehouse we just looked in? He said, sure. We used our flashlight to search it. We did them a favor. So we used our flashlights on their warehouse. They owe this to us. Have you ever heard that kind of thinking before from other police officers? Yes. I know you have. You rationalize. And that's what he was doing. And I said, Bill, this is stealing. He said, if the owner was here and we told him that we used our flashlight batteries searching his place for a burglar, he would give us the batteries. I said, yeah, you're probably right. He probably would. But Bill, problem is, he is not here. So us taking them makes it theft. And I don't think it's right. And once again, I think he thought I was going to tell on him. I said, unless you take those back, I'm going to have to talk to the sergeant about getting a new partner. He said, you would talk to the sergeant? I said, yes, I would. He went and got the alarm guy. He said, open the warehouse. He took the flashlight batteries back in. Now, I wasn't very popular with that officer, and he wanted another partner right away, and I was glad. But yes, God does label certain things wrong. And there it is. And that was wrong. That would have been theft. Now, what we need to do is you need to get ready for those kinds of tests. There's an interesting verse in the Bible, I've given it to you there, Ephesians 6:14, where it tells us to gird up for integrity. You'll notice that phrase in the Bible when you read it. Gird up for integrity. Actually, it's in the context of talking about the armor of God. Remember that, where the breastplate of salvation, or the breastplate of righteousness, and the helmet of salvation, and the shield of faith. Remember that section? Well, in that section, it talks about girding up for integrity. Well, what is girding? Well, gird in the English comes from the word girdle, which is a kind of a big belt that they used to wear during the army. It was right below the breastplate. It was sometime hardened leather, or sometime it was actually made out of metal, and it was for hanging your implements of warfare, your sword, your battle axe, those kinds of things. But what would happen, you see, this was not today where they wore army fatigues. This was in the Middle East, and they wore these flowing robes. And the phrase gird up actually was a military term that was used just prior to going into battle. And the commander, when he would see the enemy approaching, he would shout out to command, gird up. And what that meant was to grab your robes and tuck them into your girdle so they wouldn't get in the way of your feet. That's what it meant. Can I have just a little more volume on the microphone? I'm having to speak kind of loud. A little more volume? Can you just bring? Yeah, that's better. Thank you. So girding up for integrity is done before an engagement occurs. You anticipate the battle, and in this case, we're talking about being a police officer and facing moral dilemmas. You anticipate the kind of dilemmas you're going to face. You try to anticipate as many as you can. Am I going to be tempted to accept a bribe? And am I going to be tempted to overlook something illegal? You try to anticipate the issues. Then you develop conviction, a strong feeling of what is right and wrong on that issue, and then you make a commitment. Now let me give you a story that will illustrate what I'm talking about. I was working a plainclothes assignment. We were looking for dealers of heroin, and we ended up in a kind of a seedy part of town, a tough part of town, and we went up on the second floor of this hotel, and we had been told by an informant that there was a guy in a particular room that had some narcotics for sale. So we went up to the door, and we thought, that's just a small-time dealer. He's not too dangerous. So we had both of our guns in our holsters and our jackets buttoned. I had a sport jacket on that day. And being police officers at that time, we were required to wear hats. And so I had a kind of a fedora. It was summer, so it was a straw hat. So, we really looked like cops, even though we were in plain clothes. So we knocked on the door, and the guy came to the door, and he opened the door. And he stepped back, and in one hand, in his left hand, he had a balloon full of a whole bunch of smaller balloons of heroin, illegal narcotics. And in this hand, he had a .32 automatic. Now, we both had our guns in our holsters. If we hadn't have anticipated that, I may have been killed that day. But we had anticipated that. You know why? About 2 months prior, 2 L.A.P.D. officers had been captured, their guns taken from them, their own handcuffs used on them. They had been put in the trunk of a car, drove over the hill from Los Angeles into the Bakersfield area, which is kind of a desert. They got him out of the car, and they stood him there, and they shot one officer in the face, and as he fell to the floor of the desert, they pumped 3 more into his chest. The second officer, realizing what have I got to lose? Just started running zigzag, and they fired a couple shots after him and missed. And then they laughed. They said, we're going to come get you. You can't go too far. But all of a sudden, some lights went on in some farmhouses not too far away. It saved the officer's life because they were then worried about somebody calling the police because of the gunshots. The lights went on, And so they took off. And this other officer lived to tell us what happened. Well, what had happened was that out on the street, one bandit had gotten the draw on one of the officers and held a gun up against his head and told the other officer to give up his gun, that he had his partner with a gun to his head. That officer gave up his gun. Then they were both taken, their guns taken away, and what happened I just described to you. So that night at roll call, our lieutenant talked to us, and he said, I'm not going to tell you what to do because it's your life. I don't want to interfere with a decision regarding your life, but I am going to require you to do something. I'm going to require you to talk about that possibility of someone getting the drop on one of you and then demanding the other one to give up his gun. And you just might want to talk that over and decide what you're going to do, because if you don't have a plan, it'll probably happen just the way it happened to these officers. They'll both give up their guns, and one of them was killed. So we left the station. I was working with a combat veteran who had been in the war and who won a Silver Star, and he was a pretty tough guy, and I kind of knew what his answer would be. His name was Nick, best partner I ever had. I said, Nick, what are we going to do if somebody gets a gun on us? And he didn't bat an eye. He said, we're both going for our guns. I said, What if he has a gun at your head? You want me to go for my gun? Yes. You go for your gun because I'm going for mine, even though he has a gun to my head. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, wait a minute. Let's turn the other way around. What if he has a gun at my head? He said, we're both going for our guns. I said, that's what I was afraid of, So we pulled the car over, and we used to have a practice. When we'd agree on a tactic, we would have a formal agreement. And I remember that night reaching across the front seat of that police car and grasping him by the hand, looking him eye to eye. And I remember him saying, packed! And I yelled back at him, packed! We agreed right then, if someone ever gets a gun on us, we're going for our guns. Now, let's go back to the hotel. The man is standing there with a gun, the heroin. And his words were, cops, huh? And we thought, oops, this is not going to be good. And guess what I found myself doing? Going for my gun. Even though I knew he was going to shoot. We had agreed. And I'll never forget how time slows down. My hand was going, I had a cross draw. It was on this side of my body. And I remember popping my button, and my button must have not been sewed on real tight because it popped loose. And I'll never forget it floating through the air real slowly as my hand was going for the gun. And I remember I was afraid to look at his gun. I didn't want to see it go off. And as I was pulling out my gun, I thought, a horrible thought. Later on, I had to confess it to Nick. I said, Nick, remember when we were both going for our guns in the hall? He said, yeah. I said, I hate to tell you this, partner. I feel really badly about this. I was hoping he'd shoot you first. And you know what he said? He got a grin on his face, and he said, guess what? I was thinking the same thing. I mean, that's just human survival. You want to live, But as I got my gun out of my holster, his gun still hadn't gone off. And I came around into focus and began to put pressure on the trigger. And here's the picture I saw. This hand still had the heroin in it, but this hand with the gun was empty. And the gun was in the air going over his shoulder into the room. We stepped into the room, pushed him in, brought the door shut behind us. I kicked the gun on the floor under the bed where it was out of his reach. We put him up against the wall, patted him down to see if he had any more weapons, cuffed him up. And after we kind of got down off of our adrenaline high, I said, why didn't you shoot? You know what his answer was? Well, I'm going to be honest with you. You're probably not going to like this. But if one of you guys would have gone for his gun, I would have shot him. But when both of you went for your guns, I figured one of these fools is going to kill me. I got to get rid of this gun. What I'm trying to illustrate, my fellow officers, is you have to have a plan, not only for physical danger, but for moral danger. In Los Angeles, I don't know what the statistics are here, But more officers lose their jobs and their careers are ruined through moral failure than shootings. 3 times as many more officers are eliminated from the job because of moral conflicts rather than shooting situations. But this principle also applies to moral situations. One of the second or third days I was on the job, I was working a beat down on East 5th Street, a tough part of town. 5 or 6 bars, prostitutes. And there was this one prostitute that was very attractive. And boy, did she pay a lot of attention to me. And my partner saw that. He saw that she was paying attention to me. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "Vernon, I just want to tell you something. There's not a prostitute in town that would not want to go to bed with you. But it's not because of you. It's your badge. Don't forget that. Don't fall prey to that." I don't even think he was a Christian, but he had enough sense to figure that out. He had enough sense to warn me. And right that day, I don't think I would have decided anyhow, but if I was even given it any thought, right there, that day, I made a decision. I'm never going to get friendly with a prostitute. I'm going to do my duty and what has to be done, but I'm never going to do that. I'm staying away from that. I made a decision that day. And then, you know what you have to do? That night in the radio car, I said to my partner, packed. We're going for our guns? Packed. When you make decisions on moral issues, you need to tell somebody so you can be held accountable. That's a very important concept. Don't wait till it's too late. Think of as many moral dilemmas as you can think of. Take a half a day or some night for a couple hours, just write down on a piece of paper the temptations that might come your way as a police officer. Write them down. Make a decision about what you're going to do about them, and then tell somebody what your decision is and ask them, your partner, to hold you accountable. It could be something as simple as, I'm not going to accept any gratuities. That's what we call them in L.A. You say, what's a gratuity? A merchant wants to give you something. I know you police officers, you don't make much money and all that, and I just want to give you this. Do you know, my first week in a radio car, we stopped by a place to get some coffee, and the proprietor said, "Oh, we don't charge police officers for coffee. We're just grateful for what you do." And I was naive enough to figure that that was okay. And I rationalized it. Well, we do a lot for them, and I appreciate his consideration, and I accepted a free cup of coffee. In fact, I accepted several free cups of coffee from him. But about 2 or 3 weeks later, there was a red zone out in front of his place of business that was to protect a school crosswalk. They didn't want any cars parking there in case some kid stepped out from behind that car and might get killed. And so I went in the restaurant and I said, "There's a car parked in the red zone by this school zone, and I'm going to have to write a ticket on it and have it towed." He said, wait a minute. Bob, remember, I'm the guy that gives you the free coffee. Right there I learned something. There is no such thing as a free coffee. There's no such thing as a free lunch. They say they're doing it because they appreciate the job you're doing and all that. But what they're really doing is trying to get on a good side of you. Try to own a piece of you, so when you have to take some action, it's hard to do. Because they've been giving you things. You know what I'm talking about? Is this where you live? This is where I lived. And I made the mistake. I'm admitting something to you. I didn't make the right decision. But right there, I decided no more of that. And I told my partner, I'm not accepting any freebies anymore, and I'm asking you to call me on it if I ever do. I made a declaration, like reaching across the front of the front seat. Packed. That's what has to be done. First of all, decide where you stand. One of the big moral decisions, and I've already alluded to it during my time at the academy, is you're going to have a strong desire to fit in. And you know how police officers are. The language isn't the best, and some of their practices are wrong. They're accepting gratuities. And there's a basic principle in the Bible. You should never compromise. And you know, in not compromising, it's easiest to take an early stand with your partners to let them know where you're coming from. If you don't take a strong stand about where you are on right and wrong early in your career, it's possible to take that stand later, but it's going to be harder. I encourage you to take an an early stand. Later, it's a little more difficult. Change can bring questions. If you change your behavior, for instance, if you've been using a lot of profanity and all of a sudden you don't use anymore, they're going to wonder why. And guess what? That's going to give you a chance to explain why you do not use profanity, and you're not going to. Let me just pause right here and tell you a situation I really had. I was a young officer. I was working with a good cop. It wasn't Nick yet. I hadn't got up to my favorite partner, but it was another partner who was a good partner. And we made a lot of pretty good arrests. And one night, we had pulled over some guys in a car, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were by ourselves, and it was in an alley, and it was a rather dangerous situation, and we ended up getting them out without anything happening, but they were armed. They had guns. 2 of them had guns. And fortunately, we covered them in such a way with lights, and one of us was standing to the rear where they decided not to use them. But he said something to me after that arrest. We took them in and booked them for robbery. They had committed an armed robbery of a liquor store. And later on, as we were sitting at the office, we were filling out the arrest reports with a cup of coffee. He said, "Bob, we have to talk about something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "When it's 3 o'clock in the morning, we have 4 guys in a car. You don't just say, 'Get out of the car.' You say, 'Get out of the car.'" And he used a real strong, profane word. And I said, "Well, I don't use that kind of language." He said, "Yeah, I noticed that. Why not?" And here's what I told him. I said, "Well, it's because of my relationship with God. I think that would displease him." I said, "I'm not pushing that on you, but for me, I have a relationship with my God, and it's important for me not to offend him." He said, "Well, but I don't want to be killed either. And I want you to use strong language if necessary to get guys out of a car easily." I said, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to pray to my God and ask him that he gives me the ability, command presence, where I won't have to use bad language." He said, "Well, I've never heard of that, but be my guest. Give it a try." Guess what? About 4 weeks later, after many arrests, he said to me, "Bob, I'm going to take back what I said. I don't get it, but somehow God has given you the way you stand, the way you look, the tone of your voice, the look in your eye. When you ask guys to get out of cars, they get out of cars." He said, "Your God has answered your prayer, I guess." He said, "I'm not sure I believe in God, but it happened." And so, those are the kind of things you're going to have to explain. Don't overstate your reason. Don't go too far. Don't give them a whole sermon when they ask, "Why aren't you swearing?" Give them as much as you can to answer their question. And if they keep on asking questions, well, of course, keep responding. But some Christians make the mistake of when they get to ask anything spiritual, they'll give the person an hour and a half message, and you're supposed to be working, not preaching. You know what I mean? We can actually offend people and go too far. So don't overstate, but give them the information they need. I want to give you an idea here that came upon me. I don't know how much you understand here about American baseball. I know rugby is big in Britain, and I don't know if rugby's, or not rugby, what do you call it? Well, you have football, you have soccer and all that. But you understand a little bit about American baseball? And up here, we have a diamond. And, the bottom of the diamond is home base. And over here is first base. Now, I'm going to use the illustration here of adultery, because unfortunately in today's world, this is a common problem. I'm finding it's not only a problem in police departments, it's a problem in churches. I mean, in my church, we've had several incidents, and it's a big church, I admit, there's over 8,000 people there, but we've had several incidents involving people that are regular attenders of the church. So I just want to talk about the illustration of adultery. If you don't want to commit adultery, guess what? There are several steps usually that take place. First of all, there's a lot of women in America now that are in the workplace. And so there's a lot of men who see women in the workplace. The women are dressed for work. They're dressed at their best. They're looking pretty, It's not like your wife when you leave your wife in the morning, if she's staying home, her hair's all messed up and she hadn't put on her makeup, But you get to work and you see this beautiful lady who's prepared for, And the first I call going to first base is having personal conversation. Now, I understand when we work together as male and female, we must communicate. We communicate about the job. I'm talking about personal conversation. There's a difference. What movies do you like to see? And and do you enjoy this? And what kind of coffee do you like? What kind of flavors? Now you're getting real personal. And, oh, do you enjoy this? And blah, 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 blah. And now a friendship is beginning to build. It's not business talk. It's personal talk. I call that going to first base. Going to second base, why don't we have lunch tomorrow? And just you and this other person, if you're a female, it's another male, you're having lunch or coffee or something, and it starts happening pretty regular. And then guess what? Third base, dinner. Or drop by my apartment after dinner. We'll just relax for a minute and talk about the football game tonight that's on TV. And you find yourself in an apartment with another woman that's not your wife or another man that's not your husband. That's third base. Now, there's some basic rules in baseball. If you don't go to first base, you can't go to second base. And if you don't go to second base, you can't go to third base. And if you don't go to all three of those, guess what? You can't go home. You can't go and touch base, and that's adultery. So guess where you draw the line? You see where you draw the line? See it right there? You don't go to first base. You say, but it's just conversation, Bob. But it's also first base. And I just made up my mind, I'm not going to first base. And I told my secretary and my other men in my office, I'm not going to first base. What do you mean by that, Chief? Well, I'm not having lunch or anything like that with a female that's not my wife. So guess what? 3 weeks later, I got a call from a Superior Court judge. She said, Chief Vernon, I need to talk to you. It was a female judge. She said, there's a murder case we're handling with some of your officers, and I just need to talk to you. I said, okay. She said, it'd probably be most convenient for me to talk to you on a lunch break, and we have a cafeteria here, so if you'll just come over and have lunch with me, I'll explain the case to you. I said, okay. I'm thinking business. It's, about this case. I said, okay, and I hung up. Guess what? Within 30 seconds, my secretary was in the office. She had her hands on her hips. Excuse me. I said, excuse you what? She said, I heard you make an appointment to have lunch with another woman. I said, well, this is a judge. We're talking a case. She said, you made a commitment to us. She held me accountable, Mike. Guess what? I said, well, okay, call her up and tell her I'm bringing Pete, my bodyguard, with me. And if that's okay. So guess what? She called her and the judge said, yeah, that's fine. I don't care. It didn't bother her a bit. But that's what happens when you make decisions and then you make yourself accountable to other people. Isn't that kind of fun? Really works. The slippery slope, spiritually. Here's how it goes. First of all, you have a mediocre relationship with the Lord. There's very little spiritual growth. You start to get confused priorities. It's no longer important to read from the Bible. You start skipping your prayer times. Then you start having a sinful thought life. You may even start dabbling in pornography. And pornography in America has become a scourge. It's estimated that 40% of men that are regular churchgoers look at pornography. You know why? Because 15 years ago, you used to have to go to a real sleazy part of town and go into one of those sleazy porn shops, and you didn't want to be seen going in there. But now you can do it in your own house, on your own computer. And unfortunately, it's become a major problem. So this is what begins to happen. You have a sinful thought life. And then some small compromises. They're not real biggies, but you start making compromises, doing what you know is sinful and wrong, but not going real far, And finally, you're involved in gross sinful behavior. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slippery slope. And you know what? The same thing happens with corruption, mediocre behavior on the job. You don't shine your leather. You don't have your uniform pressed. You say, well, that's not corruption. No, it's not corruption, but it's mediocre behavior. Then unprofessional behavior. You start using slang words to the citizens you contact. You're not really acting like a professional. And then it gets down to negligent behavior. I'll never forget my first arrest, and this is just an example of how you can be negligent. I showed up for work. I hadn't been on the job too many months, and the watch commander said, "Vernon, see me after roll call. You're walking your beat by yourself today." I said, "Okay." He said, "I got to talk to you about walking by yourself." So I went into his office after roll call. He said, "We're looking for a man escaped from San Quentin State Prison. He's armed, considered very dangerous, and we think he's on your beat." Oh boy, I was already butterflies in my stomach from walking the beat by myself because I was still pretty new. But when I was told there was a man they were looking for who was dangerous on my beat, I really started to get a little bit nervous. Well, I had a pretty wise watch commander. He says, "Go by R&I records of identification and pick up the guy's photograph, and so you know who you're looking for." So I went over and I picked up the guy's photograph, and I didn't want to be too obvious, so I slipped it in the inside manufacturer spot there where the manufacturer's put his name, you know, inside my hat. And then I put my cap back on, so if I raised my cap, I could look through that plastic holder and I could see his picture. And you know what? Most people thought, wow, this is the most friendly cop we've ever seen, because everybody I walk by and take a look at, I'd say, "Good morning, sir." "Oh, good morning, officer." They thought I was tipping my hat at them, you know. And does that mean the same thing over here it does in America? You tip your hat? It's a greeting, you know. But I was really looking at this picture. Well, I'd been looking at that picture all day, and I made 2 or 3 arrests for drunk and disorderly, and it was getting near the end of the day, and I went by the box on the telephone pole to call a station and tell them I was alive and that I was going home. You know, you have to do that. We call it ringing off. So I went to the box and picked up, and I said, I'm getting ready to go home. I'm just going to make one more bar check. It's Bert's Bar right around the corner. So I hung up, and I went into Bert's Bar, and there sits the guy at the bar. I mean, I knew it was him. I'd been looking at this all day. Fortunately, it was a cheap bar, didn't have a mirror, so he didn't see me. I could just see a good profile of him. So a thought entered my mind. And this is what I talk about to illustrate the concept of negligence. You know what I was going to do? I was going to go home and not tell anybody that I saw him. No one would know. I was afraid he might shoot me. So I thought, well, I'll just go home and won't say anything. And then I realized, you know what? That's just wrong. I'm being paid to be a police officer. I've got to do this. And so I walked up behind him and I just uttered a prayer, quick prayer. And one of my favorite prayers to God when I was a police officer is, "Help." And that's what I prayed. And I walked up to him and I did something very unusual. I took off my hat and I pushed it right around in front of his face, and I pulled my gun. And as I was pulling the gun, I said, "Is that you?" And he looked at the picture, and he was so amazed by this novel approach. He said, "Yep, it sure is." And at that, my gun came out of the holster, and he heard the sound of the gun coming out of the holster, and he whipped around. He had been involved in a lot of crime and had been arrested many times, and he knew the sound of a policeman drawing his gun. And so he turned around, and I had the gun out there, and I backed away from him, and I was putting my hat back on, and I had a problem making the gun still. It was kind of wiggling, you know. I was scared. I was so frightened that I forgot what they called handcuffs. And I had the gun, and he said, "Now take it easy with that gun. Now, easy. Don't pull the trigger. It'll go off." Because he could see I was shaking out there, you know. And I pulled out the handcuffs, and he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to put these things on you." Couldn't even remember what they were called. And you know what? He turned around and he put his hands behind his back and he helped me put on the handcuffs. He just kept saying, "Don't pull that trigger." And he actually had me put on the handcuffs. Then I took the gun that he had stuffed in his belt. You're supposed to do it the other way around. You're supposed to take the gun first. But I was so nervous I did everything wrong, you know. Somehow the Lord protected me. And I took him in, and he told the sergeant, he said, "Sarge, that wasn't fair, sending that young rookie after me." He said, I couldn't even try to make a fight of it. He said, "One look at that kid, all the color drained from his face, a gun shaking out there." And he said, "I knew one move and it's certain death." Now, that's a true story. But the reason I tell you is to illustrate something. Many police officers don't do what they're paid to do. I was tempted to go home, to not see that man. That's another form of corruption, ladies and gentlemen. We have to decide that's not the way to go. And where does it go? It goes from negligent behavior to against regulations that the department has. The department has certain things you're supposed to do and not do, and minor infractions of the law, and all of a sudden, gross criminal behavior. I'm almost out of time, and they told me to allow a few minutes. We only have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I haven't completed what I had planned. We'll complete it tomorrow and finish up. We have some more to talk about as far as corruption and how to prepare for it, how to make decisions. I have some more examples of practical applications. But we're going to stop right now at this point and ask for any questions about anything I've said so far, or things I haven't said that you're interested in. Questions? Anyone? Don't be afraid. Yes, we're over there. Just speak out loudly.
I think a round of applause for Bob. Thank you. Just take a 2-minute stand-up and stretch break. Please don't leave the hall. As Kibengi said, we'll be dropping for tea. But while we load the next presentation, please stand up, stretch yourself, and we'll start again in another 2-3 minutes. Thank you.
See how we do.